Back in 2018, I went through a divorce that left me with practically nothing. The life I'd known was dismantled, and I was left standing in the echo of it. I managed to rent a small, affordable house, but it was completely empty, no furniture, no appliances, nothing at all. The silence in those bare rooms was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. I needed to start from scratch, a task that felt overwhelming. Especially with the limited money I had, I figured the best and only way to handle it was to look for secondhand deals online, piecing a life back together one cheap item at a time. My focus was on the bare essentials, a couch, a television, and similar basics that could make the place feel less like a shell and more like a home. It didn't take long to find some listings, and I started the tedious process of reaching out to a few sellers. During that search, I came across an ad for a TV stand listed for a reasonable $40. It was nothing special, just a plain dark wooden stand from the pictures, but it would do the job. The seller, who introduced himself as Eric in his messages, was very particular about when I could come by. He said pickup had to be after 9 p.m. on a weekday because of his work schedule, and he wouldn't do weekends under any circumstances. I thought that was unusual. Most people want to get rid of things on their days off. But since it still fit my schedule and I was desperate to get things settled, I agreed. Looking back, maybe that's why no one else had bought it yet. We settled on a Wednesday night at 9:30. He sent me his address, and I drove about half an hour to get there. I'd never been to that town before. I'd only heard the name in passing. And once I arrived, I could see why the place felt forgotten. Most of the houses were old and visibly run down, with peeling paint and sagging porches. The streets were full of deep potholes that my car thudded into, and a lot of the streetlights didn't even work, creating pockets of deep, unnerving blackness between the ones that did. When I pulled up to Eric's place, it didn't make me feel any better. The house looked just as neglected as the others, maybe even more so. Only a single weak hallway light glowed faintly from a window inside. I pulled $40 out of my wallet, folded the bills tightly into my pocket, and walked up the creaking steps onto the porch, the wood groaning under my weight. I rang the doorbell and waited, glancing around. The yard was cluttered with odd decorations, chipped garden gnomes, with vacant eyes, wine chimes made of old silverware, and other strange trinkets scattered across the overgrown lawn. And even the porch. It had a bizarre, unsettling energy. After a moment, the door opened. Eric was tall and thin, maybe in his 40s, with sunken eyes and a sickly pale complexion. He had the look of someone who hadn't slept in days, and the sour smell of alcohol was obvious when he greeted me. If I had known beforehand that this was the guy I'd be dealing with, I probably wouldn't have bothered, but I was already there. He invited me inside, and I followed him down a dim, narrow hallway. The air inside was thick and stagnant, smelling of dust and stale cigarettes. The place was messy, not exactly hoarder level, but more like a house that had been trashed during a party and never properly cleaned. When we got to the back of the house, he pointed to the TV stand in the corner of the living room. The space was so dim, it was hard to make out what kind of shape it was in. Mind switching on a light so I can see it better, I asked, my voice sounding louder than I intended in the quiet house. He didn't reply, but he walked over and turned on a small dusty lamp. In the corner around that moment, I started getting a really uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. The silence, the smell, the state of the house, something wasn't right. Before I could take a closer look at the stand, I heard a soft shuffle behind me. It wasn't a sound that alerted me, but a subtle shift in the air. Another man had appeared, stepping out from the shadows of the adjoining hallway. He was shorter than Eric, but broader, and he didn't say anything. He just stood next to Eric and stared at me with a completely blank expression. The atmosphere instantly felt charged and dangerous. I tried not to overreact, telling myself to stay calm, but the heavy silence and the way both of them just looked at me made my skin crawl. Then Eric moved from the lamp and took a position. In front of the TV stand, the two of them were now positioned on either side of me, forming a loose triangle with me at the point. They faced me without saying a single word. The room went completely still. Seconds passed, feeling much longer than they were filled, only with the sound of my own heart hammering in my chest. I didn't wait around to see what would happen next. I quickly walked past the second man, keeping my pace steady, and headed straight for the front door. My body was screaming at me to run, but my mind told me to just walk. As I stepped back out onto the porch and into the cool night air, I heard both of them burst out laughing from the living room, a strange mocking sound that echoed behind me. Halfway to my car, I heard the front door slam shut. I still don't know what that was about or what they were planning. Maybe it was just some twisted attempt to scare a stranger for their own amusement, or maybe it was the prelude to something much worse. Either way, I wasn't about to stick around to find out. I just got in my car and drove, leaving the $40 still folded in my pocket. When I was 23, I was searching for a studio apartment to rent. I had just finished college and was barely making more than minimum wage, so I had almost no budget to work with. At first, I looked for one-bedrooms and small studios, but after weeks of searching, it became obvious that I couldn't afford most of them. Reluctantly, I turned to Craigslist and checked the housing section. I knew the site didn't have the best reputation, but a friend of mine had found a place there and recommended it, so I decided to try. The first day of browsing, I didn't see anything useful, though it gave me a little hope to see how many listings were being posted. They just weren't in my price range or location. By the third or fourth day, I refreshed the page and noticed a new ad that caught my attention. It was for a unit just a few miles away. The post said it was a studio in a small apartment complex. The pictures were extremely blurry, so pixelated that you could hardly tell what you were looking at, but the description seemed fine, so I messaged the owner. He responded quickly, and we arranged a tour later that same evening around 7. From his replies, he seemed professional and polite, nothing unusual. That night I drove to the address he provided. I should mention I already knew this neighborhood wasn't the best part of the city. Still, it was cheap, and at the time I convinced myself it wasn't so bad. Looking back, I realize I was probably just desperate and ignoring the warning signs. When I arrived, I saw an older-looking apartment building. I parked on the street, got out, and texted the man that I was there. Before walking up to the entrance, he wasn't outside waiting. So, I pressed the buzzer. A few seconds later, the door unlocked on its own. Inside, there was a staircase in the middle and 2 rooms on the ground floor. Before I could figure out which unit I was supposed to go to, a voice called down from the stairwell above, telling me he was on the 3rd floor. Assuming this was the person I'd been messaging, I started walking up. At that point, I thought it was strange that he hadn't come down to meet me, especially since he'd seemed so formal and organized over text. When I reached the 3rd floor, there were 2 doors, one of them open. I walked toward it and saw a man standing inside. He greeted me, shook my hand, and invited me in. Immediately, something felt off. The place had furniture, a TV, even food. Out on the counters, it was clearly being lived in. "Does someone already live here?" I asked casually. He chuckled quickly and said no, everything would be moved out by the next day. I nodded, but the way he said it didn't feel right. He continued showing me around, pointing things out, but as I looked around, I realized this couldn't be a studio. There were multiple doors leading to separate rooms. It was clearly a larger apartment, 1 or 2 bedrooms at least. The rent he'd quoted me didn't make sense for this space. It was like he could tell I was catching on. He stopped talking, walked toward the hallway, and opened a door that led to a bedroom. He told me to step inside and check it out. Before I could respond, my phone buzzed. I pulled it out and froze. It was a message from the actual Craigslist contact, the man I had originally been talking to, asking if I had arrived yet. My stomach dropped. I looked up and realized the man standing in front of me wasn't the same person I had been messaging. He must have seen the look on my face, because he didn't move or speak. He just stared at me blankly. I didn't say a word. I quickly turned and hurried back down the stairs, listening carefully, but I never heard him follow. I rushed outside, got into my car, and drove away as fast as I could. I was so shaken that I never replied to the real owner's message. At that point, I didn't even care if the real listing was legitimate or not. I wanted nothing to do with that place. Whoever that man was, he had almost managed to lure me into his apartment under false pretenses. I don't know what his intentions were, and I don't want to find out. That night was enough to make sure I never browsed Craigslist again. I hadn't used Marketplace Hub in nearly 5 years. Honestly, I'd forgotten the platform even existed. It was a digital graveyard of old furniture and forgotten hobbies that I never needed to visit and rarely heard anyone mention anymore. But because I was preparing to move, I was faced with the unavoidable task of getting rid of a bunch of random bulky stuff that wasn't worth taking with me. At first, I called a junk removal service, figuring they'd just haul everything away in one clean go. It seemed like the simplest solution. But their estimate was over $400 for just a handful of items, including an old couch and a bookshelf. The price was so absurd it felt like a joke. That's what made me turn back to Marketplace Hub as a reluctant last resort. I made a post under the free items section, uploading a few decent photos of everything I was giving away. I assumed people would jump at the chance to get free stuff. But to my surprise, the response was almost non-existent. The few people who did message either disappeared after a couple of texts or never followed up on their initial interest. It was frustrating and a waste of time. About a week later, when I'd almost given up, a man named Derek messaged me. He said he was interested in my couch and could pick it up on any day that worked for me. Honestly, I thought it would end the same way as the others, so I didn't put much energy into it. I just replied that I worked between 9 and 5, so if he was serious, he'd have to let me know a specific time. I didn't expect him to actually follow through, but the next morning, he texted again saying he could stop by that evening around 6 p.m. Surprised by his persistence, I agreed, and on my way home from work sent him my address. The commute was about 20 minutes, and I found myself hoping he'd show up quickly. The last thing I wanted was to waste my entire night waiting around for someone who, like the rest, might flake at the last minute. But when I pulled into my driveway, I noticed an older, nondescript sedan already parked along the curb right in front of my house. It was the only vehicle on the whole street, and no one was inside. A flicker of unease went through me before I brushed it aside. It had to be Derek, just a little early. I hurried up to the front door, expecting him to be waiting on the porch, but he wasn't there. For a second, I wondered if it was just a strange coincidence and the car belonged to a neighbor I didn't know, but I wasn't fully convinced. The timing was too perfect. Once inside, I dropped my keys on the counter and texted Derek, "I'm home. When do you think you'll be here?" Then I stood by the front window, keeping an eye on the empty car. After 10 minutes of silence and no reply, I started to relax. Maybe he was running late. I turned away from the window, deciding not to dwell on it. I went to the kitchen, poured myself a drink, and was standing there, leaning against the counter, when a soft but distinct thump echoed from upstairs. It wasn't the usual creak of an old house settling. It was the sound of something solid making contact with the floor. I froze my glass halfway to my lips, setting it down without a sound. I listened closely, my ears straining against the sudden silence. After a few seconds of nothing, the quiet was shattered by the sound of heavy footsteps suddenly pounding down the staircase. Completely startled, I stared down the hallway as a man I didn't recognize bolted into view. He moved with a frantic urgency, his eyes wide as he ran straight for the front door. He yanked it open, sprinted outside, and was gone. By the time my shocked brain caught up and I reached the doorway, he was already in that car I'd seen earlier, screeching away from the curb. I just stood there in the open doorway, stunned at how fast it all happened. The entire event, from the noise to the car speeding off, couldn't have lasted more than 10 seconds. Eventually, I snapped out of it. My heart hammering in my chest, I grabbed my phone and called the police. After that, I tried calling the number Derek had used to text me, but it went straight to a generic voicemail. That's when it hit me with certainty. It must have been him. When the police looked into it, they discovered the number he'd used wasn't tied to a real name or address. It was a burner. Basically, they had nothing to go on. Despite me pushing for updates later, the case went nowhere. As far as I could tell, nothing was stolen. Maybe he didn't have time, or maybe he was waiting for the right moment for me to settle in, maybe even go to bed before realizing he'd blown his cover. That little noise I heard upstairs must have been his mistake, a slip-up that unraveled his entire plan. Once he knew I was aware someone was in the house, he ran rather than risk a confrontation. I still don't know what his true intentions were, but I can only hope I never see him again. Use arrow up and arrow down to select a turn, enter to jump to it, and escape to return to the chat.